I'm joined now by someone who started off the BBC in the early 80s, and I think a time that was particularly interesting as they're producing all sorts of shows, things like The Young Ones, of course, Doctor Who, but also many of the great Shakespeares. So I'd like to introduce someone who worked across all of these, as well as much more. So I'd like to introduce Ilsa Rowe. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Not bad, thank you. And managing to keep yourself busy during these rather odd times?
Yes, well, these odd times, I still have her 15-year-old now at home day in, day out, and a partner who's shielding. So it's been quite a strange time and continuing to work through that.
Oh, of course. Oh, right. So it's just busy, I suppose, more busy than ever, really. But so I'd like to take you back, though, to your time at the BBC when, amongst other things, you encountered Doctor Who. I was wondering if you could explain what an assistant floor manager did, or because I appreciate it's an outdated term.
Well, you were responsible mainly for props, making sure that every artist had every single prop he or she needed. And also, when you're on location, as with Doctor Who, when it went to Seville, you were really responsible for making sure that everybody was where they needed to be at the right time, and that the artists went to makeup, that then came out and then were at the right place when their shot was ready for them. But props in particular was the big responsibility. And I've actually just been looking at my old prop list from the Doctor Who filming. I know it really took me back. And of course, also because we were out in Spain, in Seville, in the heat, you're also responsible for making sure that there were things like medical equipment. I've got a list here of absolutely everything from bin bags through to remember those Polaroid cameras? Well, you probably don't remember them, but no digital cameras, Polaroid camera, salt tablets, water purifying tablets, ground sheet, not quite sure what that was for, medical Optrex and eye bath. It's a list, 2 pages of foolscap long of just things that needed to come out with us on location.
So I suppose being abroad for the filming meant it was even more complicated than perhaps it would normally be.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you had so many things to contend with. We had to get there. I mean, that was obviously my responsibility. Wasn't for actually booking tickets and sorting out the logistics of it. That would have been Gary Downey and the PA. But one of the strongest memories I've got of being at the airport, we had to change planes at Barcelona to then fly on to Seville. And I was carrying things that nowadays it just really is unimaginable. I had a little suitcase which they asked to look through, which contained some spiky skewers that were needed. The kind of long, sharp, a bit like knitting needles with a very sharp point, and a pretend hand grenade. I quite literally had a plastic hand grenade plus a spare in my suitcase. And I think it's only because of being able to say it's the BBC that we actually got away with that. Could have been very complicated, but so we had to get there. And then, of course, as I expect you can imagine, August in Seville, the temperatures were seriously hot. And again, one of my jobs in the, if anybody knows the story, it's set in a hacienda in an olive grove in Seville. And one of the other joys of being an AFM was had to do things like cart crates of waters about so that the artists actually didn't dehydrate, especially the monsters in their, I don't know what it would have been made of, but I think it was pretty much rubber. And they had to drink their water through a straw in temperatures that, you just can't imagine. Well, hard to imagine anyway. So, as an AFM, you pretty much had to do anything that anybody wanted you to do, if we're honest.
So, because I imagine going away before you make it into studio for the normal side of filming must have really bonded both cast and crew.
I guess so. Yes, I think so. I think once you're actually there in those circumstances, then definitely it does. I mean, obviously, for me, one of the most exciting things about that particular shoot was, obviously, I was very fond of Colin Baker, who was the doctor at the time. But the thing that made it really, really special, even though it was exhausting and really hard work, was the fact that the other doctor was my childhood doctor. It was Patrick Troughton. And, you know, through my childhood, he was the one that really took me through, you know, my primary school years into the beginning of my secondary school years. And also Frazer Hines as Jamie, because I can remember, I think it was his first performance in Doctor Who when he appeared, I think, in the Battle of Culloden. You know more about these things than I do, but I have a memory of watching what I then realised would have been, you know, Jamie's first episode as a child, and then suddenly here we were, literally in the TARDIS with my Doctor Who. So that was very special.
And did it live up to the expectation to work with those two? Because they were famously very close.
Yes, and they were really, really nice and very kind. And as Colin Baker was too. I mean, that, you know, those things are very special, because when you're doing the job that I used to do, you see, it's hard to explain. You see so many people, so many actors, day in, day out. It almost becomes routine. So, and you know, when there are people that you've actually really admired, and then you meet them in person and work very closely with them, then it's such a relief and so nice to find that actually they're really, really kind. And you know, because when you're an AFM or other jobs like PAs and floor assistants or makeup artists, you know, the possibility is there that the actors just take you for granted and you're just part of the scenery and there to, you know, look after them. But these were really, you know, and I'm not just saying that for these purposes. It was a very, very happy memory. Yes.
Yeah, because I think if you look at a lot of the pictures behind the scenes, everyone seems to be enjoying themselves. And whether that's the location or the company, but you know, I'm glad to hear it was the same on camera as off.
Yeah, definitely. Not. I mean, I looked for my photos, but I don't think I better. Most of them were the people relaxing around the pool, that kind of thing. Because the one thing about the BBC in those days, you did get to stay in a nice hotel, certainly far superior than the sort of hotels I would have stayed in for holidays. So Spain hot, at the end of a really long hot day, it was lovely to be able to go for a swim in the pool and relax with everybody.
Oh, I'm glad to hear you got to enjoy it rather than just, you know, it wasn't too much of a work holiday then. But of course, here,
it was very hard work. I wouldn't knock that, but yes, there were moments where you could wind down. Yes.
And of course, Doctor Who is a show that's always had a very strong following here in the UK. When you were filming in Spain, was there an interest in it, or was it just another film crew?
Sadly, I've no idea. I mean, really, you're so focused, you know, you are really in a bubble. My job, I would get up at sort of, I think it was 4 or 4:30 in the morning, because obviously we had to work. Well, we had to work when it was cooler. So I can remember going into the hotel breakfast room, because none of the staff would be up and they'd leave everything out for us overnight. So I'd make sure the breakfast was waiting so that when people came down, before they then piled into the bus to go out to the hacienda. And then, of course, you were just working. You were there, then you came back, and as I say, sort of, you know, it really was go for a swim and then go to sleep. And then, so with the best one in the world, we didn't really meet, apart from the two young people who Gary Downey had booked to help us with language and I don't know what you'd call them, a sort of facilitator. So there was a young woman and a young man who were there, who were Spanish, and I think lived locally. I don't think they were anything to do with sort of the television in Spain. But apart from them, to be honest, that's one of the sad things, that you didn't meet didn't have anything to do with any of the locals, not for this, quite different from what I do now, which is quite the opposite in terms of foreign filming, but we can wait for later for that.
So having been out to Seville, obviously worked very hard and enjoyed the weather, coming back to studio must have seemed fairly mundane in contrast.
I guess so. Do you know, honestly, that's the bit I remember least, coming back. And remember rehearsals in the acting room, rehearsal room, but the actual studios I've got, so it compared with being out on location, it did, because I did more than just the Two Doctors. I worked on one of the Collins series, and I was tracking my brains before doing this to try and remember what the storylines were and who was in it, and I can't. Isn't that sad?
Because particularly the Two Doctors, it's almost a story of two halves, and that you start on a space station and end up in Seville, which I think is certainly the more memorable bit, and I think where the cast really get into the story.
I think so. I mean, again, I had to remind myself of the story. I had to Google it. That's really sad, isn't it? Because again, when you're working like that, everything's very disjointed, because you're filming out of sequence. You're not filming in a storyline sequence. And again, looking at my lists, I can't find the scripts. They will be somewhere, but I've got lists here of what's needed in different scenes, but you're filming out of sequence. So sometimes it's actually quite hard to have any idea what's actually going on. With the best one in the world, it was a complicated story, wasn't it?
Yes, it's between different time periods
and yes. So my memory of actually what was happening is a little bit hazy.
And the director of that story, Peter Moffat, had done an awful lot of Doctor Who, and this was his last story. Had you worked with him before?
I don't think so. I don't think so, no. As I say, because there's so many different things, and also because in one's previous role as a floor assistant, you were often quite remote from the rehearsals. You'd go in for that role, you go in on a studio day, you're given a running order, you've got to just very quickly work out who's who, when they're supposed to be, wherever they're supposed to be, and quite often the director and everybody who's up in the gallery, you would hear what was going on, but had very little contact, unless you were working regularly on a particular series, and then obviously you got to know people on the weekly turnaround for the studio day. But it's not quite the same as when you're an AFM, where you're with the cast and the director, like through the rehearsals and through to the final studios.
And you say this was naturally, a particularly complicated show to work on. Did it prepare you well for what the BBC would sort of throw at you afterwards?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you survived that, seriously, if you've survived something like that, you can pretty much survive most conditions. I mean, it was the heat. And obviously, although I'm saying, everybody was very nice and happy, there were lots of moments when people were very stressed, including me, and including when things went wrong. I think there was even, what's the famous term with film rather than video, when there was a hair in the gate? Have you heard of that? I think that's the expression. And they literally had to send it back to London to be looked at. And then we had to reshoot a scene. There were things like that happening. And obviously a lot of the actors, literally in meltdown because it was so hot. If you imagine an olive grove in the sort of temperatures you get in Seville in midsummer in August. So I think, in answer to your question, if you can get through that and come out okay, then really you could almost face anything that's coming, yes.
Because even the humanoid parts for Patrick Trout and Jacqueline Pearce, none of their costumes were particularly designed for that heat. Even some of them put in wigs.
Yes, there were wigs, there was complete prosthetic, faces, arms, and I've got a photo which I couldn't find somewhere. I'll try and find it for you. Of was it Clinton? I think he's called
Clinton Grain.
Yeah, one of the monsters, and they had to use oh goodness, what's it called? Is it the green sticky stuff? And he was sitting there covered with his monster costume, green. I can't remember the name of it. It's something that visual effects people, any of the visual effects people out there will know, all over his arms, and this poor person having to sit and wait for his turn, because of course, you had to have people standing by. You couldn't suddenly, say, oh, I'll just go off and find them. And they had to put up with an awful amount, a huge amount, definitely.
But am I right in thinking that wasn't your final encounter with Doctor Who, in that you would have worked on one of J&T's pantomimes?
I did. Can you see that?
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, yes, that was pretty much the follow-on. After that would have been, I think, I was trying to work it out. I think it was the Christmas of 84, 84 into 85. And yes, that was at the Gaumont Gaumont Theatre in Southampton, and with that current cast, not Patrick and Fraser, but it was Colin Baker, Nicola Bryant, Anthony Ainley, Jacqueline Pearce. They were all taking part in the pantomime, and I did the assistant stage manager role for that. So spent my Boxing Day, I think we opened on Boxing Day, had very little rehearsal. We had a few rehearsals in London and then down to Southampton, and it snowed. I travelled up because my family lived only about an hour's drive away, and I can remember struggling to get back in the snow, having spent Christmas with all my family, getting my parents and my sister to make cotton wool snowballs. We needed cotton wool snowballs so Colin could, who was playing buttons, could bat them into the audience. And also the Christmas Eve, struggling round Southampton, desperately trying to find a substitute for a huge job lot of crazy foam for the custard pies that wasn't foaming. We had a dress run, and bought in London from the proper place. It just wasn't functioning, so it was spray cans of foam, and desperately trying on Christmas Eve, when you open on Boxing Day, to find or make or concoct a substitute. So quite stressful. And on the Boxing Day it snowed, and Nicola Bryant, who obviously was playing Cinderella, didn't make it for the first. They had to announce that that the understudy was going to have to go on, and then she made it at the last minute, having the weather conditions having held her up, because it was snowy and icy. But apart from that, it was an interesting run, very different from TV, obviously, as you're running straight through, well, because you're a stage manager as well. So, so that was an interesting Christmas experience.
I can't think there's many that went from television centre to work on the theatre side of things. So how did you be involved? How did you become involved with it? Did John Nathan Turner just ask you?
Yeah. Yes, they were going to do it over the Christmas period, and I'd been working with them. That was in the run-up to that. So he said, "We're doing this. Do you want to do it?" And it seemed like something you don't turn around, and also meant getting an equity card as well. So that was a bonus, because in TV you don't get that. So you never know when that might be handy. But no, I mean, I was really glad to do it. But that was actually, I would say, probably more traumatic than filming in Seville.
So you'd not done any theatre before that then?
Not professionally, no. I used to do lots at university, did Edinburgh and all the things that most students who are interested in these things do. And I'd also been a member of Questers, the Quester's Theatre in Ealing that lots of people at the BBC used to do to kind of get, because it was like, although it's an amateur theatre, it was about as professional as an amateur theatre can be. So that was had a good reputation. Yeah.
And those pantomimes were very much the brainchild of J&T.
Yeah.
So I imagine you must have had a lot to do with him over the course of the filming and the story. How was he to work with?
Oh, he's fine. I mean, he's a character. I mean, in many ways, I had more, because of the role I had, it was more with Gary Downey, the production manager, in terms of day-to-day things, and obviously with Peter because he was directing it, whereas J&T was sort of more kind of like a shadow there, making notes, apart from with the panto, where he's much more, where you work much more directly with him. But yes, I'm pretty sure I can remember going to do probably planning for the pantomime or something in Brighton, in their apartment in Brighton, but I can't remember quite what that would have been for. It would have been for a meeting for one of those things, yes.
But away from the world of Doctor Who, you worked across so many different shows, and I think that was the joy of the BBC at the time, that as staff you were across so many different genres. Something like The Young Ones, which did the first series, that must have been great fun, but I imagine complicated to work on in a different way to Doctor Who. Yeah,
well, you see, that one, I was floor assisting that. I wasn't AFMing it. And with the best will in the world, looking at it now, of course, you look at it and we all know the episodes, we all know. But I can remember walking, I don't think, I was looking in my diary the other day, I don't think for the first one that we were invited to the tech run. And you literally, as I say, you came in on the day, thought, Young Ones, what's this? Absolutely, just another show. And they did it in 2-day stints, as far as I remember. So the first day was out of sequence visual effects. And as anybody who knows the Young Ones knows, everything from hammers falling from the sky, ham sandwiches falling from the sky, hitting people over the head with saucepans in the kitchen. And then the next day they would do everything through, it's a rehearsal, and then for a live audience, studio audience. And I can just remember coming in, and obviously my job in those days was to make sure that all the actors were where they were supposed to be, and that included the band, because they always had, do you remember they have anybody who watches Young Ones, there was always a band like Madness or coming on who suddenly appear from nowhere. And I just remember coming into the studio, looking at my running order and not knowing, it was so hard to get your head around what was going on. Certainly in that first studio and the visual effects day, it was actually quite scary. But once you got to know it and know who people were, then things started to make sense. But no, I floor assisted the whole of that first series. That was a lot of, that was quite fraught, got quite tense. And quite often you'd suddenly find that the band that you thought you'd got them waiting, ready, on cue, had suddenly disappeared somewhere. And it was quite hard to know what was going on. And I think the audience were quite confused too, because now we all look at it and we think we all know every episode, but at the time it was revolutionary. I mean, it really was something that I don't think anybody had really seen before.
Yeah, I think certainly a one-off or a trailblazer at least, because all of those involved had been very active in the comedy circuit. And was there a sense at the time that it was something special, or a lot of people just sort of going, what is this? I
think at the time, I would say it was probably the what is this? It was like kind of, so out there that people were kind of like confused, I suppose. But obviously once it was aired, it's become a cult, hasn't it? It really has.
It's still remembered and viewed today. It's still hugely successful.
Yeah, I can still, it's very interesting actually, I can still picture standing, because obviously when you watch it on screen, it's so different, especially when there's an audience in the studio, from watching it where you watch it when you're working on the studio floor. And I can still remember sort of standing in, it's not the wings, but the TV equivalent of the wings, and watching what was going on with roller disco, definitely the ham sandwich descending, and the band suddenly appearing, and I suppose also at the time we didn't know how many of those young comedians, who were actually pretty much the same age as I was, were going to, how famous they were going to become. Jennifer Saunders was in it, and before she was well known, obviously there's the famous, as well as the main cast of Rick Mail and Ade Edmondson and co, there were the Stephen Fry, Emma Thompson. I mean, just think about how many people were in that who then went on to have their own shows. Yeah,
a real sort of starting place for, as you say, so many well-known names. But
yeah.
Would this have been early work for you as well, or were you quite established at the BBC by that point?
Well, no, that was fairly sort of mid-term, I would say. I mean, I'd started as a production secretary, so I had done a kind of a year or so before moving into, it's basically a year or two at everything. And actually that, people think, well, that must have been very boring, but I was so lucky. I mean, to this day, I think it could have ended up typing in personnel or some admin area of the BBC, but I had two roles within my sort of secretarial time. First, I had a stint in television training. Now, if you're interested in TV, even if your job is, typing the letters, booking the taxis, that kind of thing, you get, especially if you've got nice, helpful people who are encouraging you. I was able to go and watch elements of courses, see what other people were learning to do, as long as I did my own job, but out of hours or in the evenings when you'd finished, everybody's always so keen to let people, learn from other people, I suppose. And then the next post was, and really, again, so lucky, was as production secretary on the Paperbacks programme. So it was a proper programme, and that was presented by Robert Key and Terry Jones. They each did a stint, so Terry Jones as Monty Python, Robert Key, the well-known journalist. And again, I was so lucky because they could have kept me stuck in the office, answering the phone when they all went off to the studio each week. But I came and had a role within the studio day. We put the phones on answer phone back at Kensington House, which was then Music and Arts Department. So I got, at the age of 22, to meet all these writers that, again, because I studied English and history at university, people that you'd admired. You suddenly thought, my goodness, I've got to offer Melvyn Bragg, John Gielgud, Quentin Crisp, all sorts of people. Would you like a glass of wine? How are you? Do sit down. The producers will be here soon. And, again, there's a learning curve. It really couldn't have, and they were just so good at making sure you got a chance to learn, so that then when you wanted to move on, you'd had experience, in the studio and working very closely with the presenters, which was really good.
And of course, by the time you work on some of the Shakespeares, those BBC Shakespeares, I think, are so well known because of the production values, but also the cast. So that must have been a fantastic environment once again to be amongst.
I think, yes. I mean, there I was floor assisting it. I wasn't AFMing it. So my job was to make sure that the actors were where they were supposed to be. And again, it's like, I think with Merry Wives in particular, I can remember people often think that well-known, because they had a lot of National Theatre actors, people, serious actors, not that I'm saying TV actors aren't serious actors, but, you know, there were a lot of people from the theatre who also took part. And because the cast was huge, we were in, I think for Merry Wives, I think it was the largest studio, I think it was TC1. But they normally, I expect most people appreciate that normally the lead actors have the better dressing rooms, the ones with the ensuite and the sofa and everything that are nearer the studio, so they only have to sort of step a short way. But because there were so many actors taking part in these productions, you'd have really established actors like, I'm pretty sure it was Michael Bryant and others who, I'm sure it might even have been Alan Bennett. I think it was Alan Bennett, who was stuck sharing dressing rooms with each other in the basement in Television Centre, and not a fuss, I think it was Michael Bryant and Alan Bennett. I'll have to check that, or we might have to check that on Wikipedia or on Google afterwards. But going in, and you would expect people like that to say, well, why am I in the basement? Why haven't I got, dressing room number 1? But they just thought it was a hoot and took it not for granted, but took it in their stride, which shows how professional they were.
Yeah, of course, and I think that's certainly something very special to the time. It'd be very different to produce those with that cast today. But nowadays, you've moved away from the world of BBC and television and produce multimedia language tools and education for children.
Yes, but it is still this is where I was saying earlier about the foreign filming. We produce materials. We have a company which has actually been running now for over 20 years, where it brings together, I suppose, all the things that my partner and I have in common, which is also the languages is another thing that was part of my past, pre-BBC past, and a background of a family and education. And we produce materials which are basically, well, in the olden days, video-based. Now, obviously, we run them online, but the core of our materials are the films that we produce. So we take very simple, we're called early start languages, and we take it's for what we call non-specialist primary teachers, so to help children engage with the language, have an enormous amount of fun with it, but to see not the strange things about foreign countries, but to actually see what their peers, what life's like for children in Spain, children in Germany, children in France. So we borrow, but what we do, which is very different from the BBC side of things, is we take a very small crew, so it basically be me directing, camera person and a sound recordist. And occasionally, if we've been somewhere where it's more complicated, like when we went to Morocco, we take someone to help us with fixing and so on. But we try and keep a very low profile, and we borrow a school for a week, or we borrow a class plus other a class that we focus on. So a normal primary school class, probably 10-year-olds is roughly the age group. And we put them into situations where it's as real as possible, but the language is really, really simple. We borrow their families. We've recreated Christmas in France. We've been to French markets. The most recent one was Spain, which is why I was joking about the Spanish filming, where we borrow a lovely class in a lovely primary school, work with colleagues. Actually there we were working with colleagues from the Spanish embassy who sort of can help with a lot of the pedagogic side of things. And we film out and about, persuade people in shops to let us film in the real environment, but it's all put together. And that's one of the things that I do that I absolutely have always loved doing is the editing. We don't put it out, we do it in-house. And these films are used for the teachers to use as part of their core teaching for primary languages, languages in primary schools.
So how did that first come about? Because I can sort of see the similarities between some of the BBC work, but it must be quite a step away from what you've done at Television Centre.
Well, in a way, it was a step away, but all of everything that I've talked about, the idea of having to plan everything, to make your lists, to know what's needed before you go, and to work through sort of how you're going to, because obviously when we're filming, we might have an idea of how it's going to go together, but you're filming out a sequence. If we're filming in school, we don't go from the school to the shop to the house. And so it's sort of putting together, I suppose, all the things that one learnt from that, including how to relate to people when you're out and about, because and to one of the things I'd wanted to do was also to move into sort of directing and putting together, constructing, and it's actually, so there's lots of links. You're taking the principles, and obviously when you're editing things, when you as an AFM, continuity is one of the nightmares you have to live with, about whether you've got a scene such out of order, whether somebody should or shouldn't be carrying the suitcase, or in a hospital sequence having the drip in their arm or not, and those kind of things. When we're out and about, if you think, right, we're filming a picnic in the hills in Spain, have we got the food, have we got enough, so that we did a birthday party once where the kids started to eat all the food. And obviously if you're going to take things, you're not filming just the party as it happens. You have certain things you need to do and where you need to be. Have we got enough? No, don't eat the birthday cake yet. So we've been all over the place with this. We've been to Morocco, filming in very rural parts, because this was for a French language materials. Again, with a huge bureaucracy to try and sort out before you go, to get permission to film in schools in Morocco, in both the capital Rabat and in very, very remote rural areas. And in those days, my son was only coming up for 2, so he used to come too, because I couldn't leave him behind. But we did have to take somebody to look after him. And he does crop up in most of the shots. Somewhere you see this child growing through, so he's now 15, doesn't appear in it anymore. But of course, with coronavirus, we're really, at the moment, it's a real problem, because we were due, or planning, because obviously things start to look out of date and you have to update them. We were planning a French trip for literally this sort of end of the summer term, which clearly has gone by the by. So quite what we do and how that's going to work for the future, I'm actually not quite sure, because at the moment I don't think we'd be welcome coming into people's homes or into schools. So we've got to keep our fingers crossed that things improve from that point of view.
Yeah, of course. Well, I hope you hope to get back out there and filming again soon. But I was curious, because you look at so many different languages. How is it doing a fairly, I suppose, small-scale production that isn't, perhaps extensively scripted and storyboarded in so many different countries? Are different countries more challenging than others to work in?
It just varies, really. Obviously, for someone like Morocco, that was a one-off. Getting permissions, it gets harder and harder as well, with child protection issues and things like that. So it does vary a lot, because different countries seem to be more relaxed about different things, if that makes sense. So Spain seemed to be very relaxed about a lot of things, but actually my Spanish is probably my weakest language, so it's harder then to communicate, whereas in Germany, people think the Germans are very sort of formal things, but it wasn't at all. People are generally very welcoming. I think they like the idea that their country and their is being represented in a really interesting way. I mean, we went to Freiburg for our second German set of films, and the premise of that is Freiburg is Germany's greenest city. So we went to, although we were looking at my house, who I am, one of the places we went to was a solar village where everybody's house is designed not just with solar panels, but with everything you need for a green lifestyle. And where the football stadium, we filmed in a football match. Well, actually, no, we filmed the stadium for the match, but because of TV rights, we weren't allowed to film the actual match. We had to film the warm-up, and then with clever editing, make it look like the match was going on. And there, the whole football stadium's covered in solar panels. I mean, literally, all their energy was coming from solar. And we have shots which you just couldn't imagine in the UK around a football stadium, of rows and rows and rows and rows of bicycles, where a full SC Freiburg football stadium, where a huge number of the people had cycled to the match. So those are the kind of things that are subtext for the films. So the language might be about, I like football, I play football, or whatever, but what goes behind it and what you see is as much part of it as learning the steps of learning the language, if that makes sense.
Wow, well, it certainly sounds like you're still very busy and taking what you learned at the BBC in a wonderful and interesting direction. I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time, Ilsa. It's been an absolute joy to hear about how you started off, but also what you're up to now. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for asking me.